There's a couple of places on TV you may have seen me. If you don't watch TV, that's okay, neither do I. But History Channel has a thing, Vampire Secrets, Secret Lives of Vampires, Reels Channel, a whole bunch of other things. Basically, if there's been a vampire documentary in the past, I think now I have to say 25 years. If I'm not on it, I've been consulted on it. I was consulted for stuff with True Blood, a CSI episode that they did with vampires uses some of my stuff. And if you recognize me with a blindfold, you may have seen me on Paranormal State walking around in haunted locations in high heels. Before any of that, I am a writer, have always been a writer, will always be a writer. That is probably the most significant constant. And I love research, particularly vampires, where they come from, what the mythos is. Now, I like audience participation, and I particularly like to kind of go where people want to hear, because this is a vast topic, and I could probably talk for 3 days on it. And we could go for like the very, very ancient origins of vampiric things that kind of like lead into what becomes the vampire in folklore. I could start with the focus on folklore of the vampire that we know, which is predominantly in Eastern Europe, and how that makes its transition from folklore to fiction. We could go have a merry romp through the fiction and the pop culture portrayals of vampires, or we could get into stranger territory still with some of the magical implications and psychic implications of vampires. Any preferences?
I like the folklore.
I had a feeling it would be a folklore night, and I'm totally okay with that. There's so much neat stuff to go digging around in that. So these days, if your vampire isn't Count Dracula, he's a sparkly, mopey teen. And as much as it makes me cringe, the thing about when someone takes the vampire into fiction, the writer does put their own creative spin on it. And that, if it picks up enough among popular culture, begins to be worked into the archetype of folklore of the vampire. And that's something that's been happening, so that the vampire that we recognize, even in Count Dracula, is a creature largely created from fiction. The vampires of folklore have some things in common. And I'm going to focus primarily, to start with, on Eastern European folklore. That's mainly where our vampires come from. Now, there are entities you could argue are vampiric all around the world, anything that feeds off of people and life force and whatever. Matthew Bunsen is one of the main culprits of picking, does it eat something from people? It's a vampire, under which heading you end up with Chupacabra as a vampire, among other things. Although if you get into some of the Asian vampires, you have things that, like, pardon if there are kids present, I don't think that there are, but things that, like, suck somebody's life out of their anus. I mean, like, some really, really weird things that feed off of people. And the Penangalan, that is the head of a person that detaches, and the viscera go floating around, and it goes off and eats people and comes back and reattaches to the body, and then goes walking around like an ordinary person in the day. Eastern European vampires, we largely have them. They largely survive for us. There was a fellow named Dom Augustin Calmet. He was a Benedictine monk. He's writing around the same time as the witch craze, which starts to elide into a whole vampire craze that hits Eastern Europe. And in a lot of ways, he was an early paranormal investigator in a very, very loose sense, because he would take reports of unusual occurrences, record them as they were reported by people, note if that person was, in his opinion, a credible witness, note other witnesses, and then apply his version of scientific method, which was looking at biblical precedents to see if any of this was possible within the realm of how he saw the world worked, which was very steeped in biblical stuff, because this is before the Age of Enlightenment. Now, that he's writing before the Age of Enlightenment with this much, he's really meticulous with trying to get it down. I mean, it's still anecdotal, but if you have ever heard the story of Peter Plagojewicz and Arnold Powell, and those are spelled variously many different ways, Powell especially. Powell was a fellow who fell off of a cart and came back as a vampire. He also recorded one of the stories of a fellow who had been a soldier. and while he was a soldier, he was attacked, or he felt that he had been attacked by something, and the war was over. He came back to his village. He died, and he was very convinced that because he had been attacked by something that he identified as a vampire, he'd come back as a vampire himself, and his neighbors agreed after he was dead. The vampire of folklore, in many ways, is more a peasant than a noble, often is not a pale, attractive thing. Red as a vampire is something that was said to drink like a vampire, was to say, when you get like all the little capillaries that are burst and such, you would get as red as a vampire in the face. And upir, upior, these root words for to drink, to sup, are all the things that are wound up with the word that we ended up taking from this, but there are multiple words. Virkalakis, which means drum-like. That goes into the idea that the vampires, again, weren't sleek and svelte. When they dug these corpses up, and they were corpses that they would dig up as suspected vampires, they saw a corpse that was bloated. They believed that that meant it had been feasting on its neighbors and had grown fat on them. It was usually swimming in what appeared to these peasants as blood. If Grissom had gone back in time and told them exactly how bodies decay, you wouldn't have had any of these problems at all. They would often be red. There were reports where they felt that the hair had grown post-mortem, the nails had grown post-mortem. Examining the teeth, it seemed to them the teeth had gotten longer. And there was a whole list of things to look for with a suspected vampire. I'll get into why they were digging their neighbors up in the first place in a minute, because there's actually, Dom Augustin Calmet makes it make sense. For the longest time, it really didn't. The vampire outbreaks were, of course, connected to disease. A whole bunch of people, usually in a single family first, would die. The first person to die would be the one generally suspected as being the vampire and coming back to take all of their loved ones with them. And then it would sort of like spread to the people that were close friends. Now, we know about vectors and pandemics and contagion. And we know now that in many cases it's tuberculosis, but there's a host of other things that would have been getting passed around. We know now that that's a pattern of this is someone who's come into contact with these people and probably passed the same germ to them. But at the time, they have no understanding of this. All they see are people wasting away and dying. And they want to stop it. They don't have a whole lot of recourse to fix the problem. Hang garlic, which was not just used for vampires, it was an apotropaic for a whole lot of things. And it wasn't just garlic. Rowan and red thread, there's hawthorn, and a whole host of little folk remedies for trying to drive the evil away. Apotropaic is just that. It's something that tries to drive away the bad stuff. When they would identify what they thought was the cause of it, the root, their recourse was to go try to cut it out at the root. We go and cut out the cancer. They go to the local cemetery, dig someone up, and check to see, is this a vampire? The criteria was a corpse that was undecayed or appeared to them to be undecayed and lifelike, had these other signs of some sort of continued life in the tomb. So the growing nails, the elongated teeth, the growing hair, all of which is a misperception on how decomposition works, frankly. And what they would then do is kill the thing. But a little bit less than killing it, it was more transfixing it, doing things to keep this person from rising from the grave. This is why the most classic one, drive a stake through the heart. It's not just that you're destroying the heart, you are literally nailing them down into the tomb so that they don't get up and go walking around. In Asian traditions, there's hopping vampires, which confused the ever-loving heck out of me until I talked to a native Chinese person. I'm like, really, hopping? What the heck? Like I'm not going to be. Why do they hop? It's like, oh well, you tie the toes together so they can't run after you when they rise. Oh, so it's pretty much a different version of a stake. I mean, it's the same idea. It's also why they would sometimes drive long nails into the top of the ground over the tomb if they didn't actually dig the person up, so that they'd be impaled on the things when they tried to get out. Like, they were very literal about, there's this dead body, it's underground, and it is getting up out of the ground somehow to go and eat people. The more peculiar one was a report, and it's not just Rosemary Ellen Guiley who repeats it. I ran across it in The Werewolf and Vampire in Romania, which is a treatise. I believe it's somebody's master's thesis. The fellow is Harry Sen, and he went to Romania in the 70s, and there was a whole village that swore up and down in the 1970s that their local vampire didn't just get up and walk around, he drove his coffin through the streets at night like an automobile.
Snazzy ride.
There are some weird, obscure references of vampires that manifest as wagon wheels that made no sense whatsoever to me until I encountered some Asian traditions of spirits, restless spirits that would come back as these flaming wheels. And they're basically souls that died with really, really bad karma and were coming up and taking people who were just as bad as them. And that Buddhists might use a wheel as a symbol because it's one of their significant holy symbols, makes a whole lot of sense. And that there may have been some cross-cultural contamination to lead to a vampire wagon wheel that like ends up being an addendum in any encyclopedist's collection of like, well, okay. And then vampire pumpkins, which I still haven't figured out. Because they didn't even really have pumpkins at that time. So, vampire pumpkins. So, why would they have, who was the first person who was like, John, Mary, and Sue are dying, clearly it's Jack, and when we dig him up, he's not going to be rotted, and that means he's a vampire. So where does this even come from? Dom Augustin Calmet made it make perfect sense, and it has everything to do with geography and religion. Western Europe, Roman Catholic, Roman Christian. Eastern Europe, Orthodox Greek, has a great sway there. In the Roman Church, if someone dies and they do not decay, that's a sign of purity. They are a saint. There's tons of stories, and there are still relics of saints who, by their perception, have not decayed, and that is a proof of exactly how holy they are. Actually, they would fight over who got to divvy up the bits of these saints, so each of them could keep like a little finger bone and thing, and found convents around them. Over in the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, the belief, part of their excommunication ceremony was to curse someone to be rejected by God and nature so that the ground would not accept them, and so that the very earth would just spit them back up, and so that they would not decay. Decaying was a sign that the soul was released and that that they had been accepted to heaven. And so it became customary in many places. After about a year of someone dying, they would go and dig them back up to see whether or not they'd gotten the golden ticket to heaven. And if they didn't look like they did, well, something was bad. They were clearly evil and cursed, so you needed to do something to make sure that didn't get passed on to anybody else. Beheading, burying them back face down, so when they try to crawl their way up, they end up crawling their way down. Wrapping them in fishnets. Not those type of fishnets. I know, like 5 people are like, Frankenfurter, what? No, wrong type of fishnets. In a humorous sort of way, it seems like you die, you come back a vampire, and suddenly you have OCD, because the idea with fishnets was like, they explained it as they would be compelled to untie every single knot. But it's just another way of binding them, of tangling them up, of catching them in a skein. The food offerings, though, casting mustard seeds or rice or any number of tiny little grains and things on the where the tomb is. It's not that they are compelled to count the grains. In reading between the lines for a lot of the folklore of the vampire, what you have, aside from really confused peasants who don't know how disease works, who don't know really how decay works, you have the remnants of an ancestor cult, a pre-Christian belief of the hungry dead who would come and specifically seek out their family if they had not gotten the proper offerings. I'm going to totally blank on the Frenchman's name. He started. Who's played Skyrim?
Wait, I've watched people play.
Well, okay, Draugr. Draugr are basically, well, they look more like zombies. They are, for the longest time, I didn't think the Scandinavian countries really had much of a vampire myth. They were one of the ones that kind of like seemed like an outlier. Mainly because it never got to the point of, here's the restless dead that we saw coming back and eating people. You would bury your heroes, you would bury your kings in these great grand barrows. They would be put in state almost like Egyptian pharaohs, and they were believed, much like pharaohs, to continue another life in the tomb, which is why they were provided with food. They were provided with a feasting hall. That's pretty much what a barrow is. And in the core of this ancestor tradition, if you didn't give them the proper offerings, well, they were angry Viking dead, and they'd come and beat it out of you. The ways in which they would attack people, pressing them down, strangling them, breathing their life. That Lenormand is the Frenchman's name. He's got a couple of really good books on this where he crisscrosses the two and just kind of goes point for point. You can see where there was this European belief that is pre-Christian of what the dead would do once they were dead, and what would happen if you didn't appease them properly. Which, when you take it and you apply the Christian ideals, that all becomes demonized. So they're no longer the blessed dead. You know, never mind that they're still angry if you don't feed them right. But the fact that the dead still live in the tomb, now that's just bad. Like, that is hell, that is devils, they're possessed by things, and categorically you have to do something to take care of it. So steeped in all of that, and then there's the blood. It is false to say that in every case of the folklore, vampires drink blood. There are many reports of vampires who sucked the life from the fields so that the grain withered. There were living vampires, and the line between vampire and witch in this case is a really thin, weird one. Now, these people were often marked from birth. They would have vampiric and magical abilities through life, and they were categorically believed once they were dead, they'd come back as the undead variety. The line between vampire and werewolf also was really, really thin and very tangled. Several of the old words for vampire were originally words for werewolf. And that's actually the aggravating part about the folklore, is the digger you deep. The further you dig, or the deeper you dig, which I think was what I was trying to say, the more you realize that we don't have neat boxes for these things. We don't have neat labels. The line between witch, werewolf, vampire, demon, and fairy is all kinds of mixed up. The living people who had these abilities, who might be while alive werewolves, who might be while alive witches, and who were probably coming back as vampires once they were dead, could take vital energy from people, could take it from, in the ways that the witch trials accuse many witches of, could take the ability of the cows to give milk. Like, there was some power that they could siphon. And so the blood was not always attached to things, but the blood, especially once the whole region is Christianized, is a flashpoint, because blood is a tremendous taboo, and at the same time, the Bible tells them that the blood is the life. So if part of their belief is that these things take life force in some form or another, blood is life. So even if they saw no evidence of bites, and there were some that definitely reported this, and there were some that didn't see it at all, the belief was blood had been taken. Most of the arguments that blood had been taken really came down to seeing the corpse swimming in fluid. And that's really just like this pinkish, nasty stuff that it happens when things decay. I mean, one of one of the more interesting stories. There's a fellow who I believe it was Mykonos in Greece, and this is a case of the Virkalakis. So there's some craziness going on, and it is, I think, the early 1800s, and there is a French botanist who's pretty much stuck on this island with his buddy. They're not sure they're even getting out because the peasants in the area that they have a very dim view of have all gone nuts about this one guy who they have decided is a Virkalakis, a vampire. The guy had been a drunk and, frankly, an asshole in life, and he had died. Somebody murdered him, and that was a recipe for coming back as a vampire, as restless dead. And people were dying. People were saying that he was breaking into their houses. One lady had him like break in and break her crockery. I mean, just all sorts of like, you know, there's terrible things going on. It's this guy. We need to do something about it. And the French botanist is just kind of like, well, doing what you do when you're the 19th century science guy, just kind of like, oh, these natives are doing these strange things, and here's this belief. And he reports the whole process of them digging the guy up. And they elect a butcher to be the guy to take the dude's heart out. And he tries to go for the heart through the stomach, which, well, clearly the butcher hadn't ever butchered a person before, which I suppose is a good sign. So he had a little trouble with the diaphragm. Finally, like after fishing around in this mostly decayed corpse, he got something that he kind of identified as a heart. And you know, they destroyed the heart, they buried the guy, and they hoped that that was the end of it. And it isn't quite. And you can find this whole report online. And Paul Barber has this and a whole bunch of the other ones that Dom Augustin Calmet reports in Vampires, Burial, and Death, which is a really, really good resource. And hope you're not squeamish about how things die, because he really goes into the nitty-gritty of it. All of that leads, there is actually a vampire tradition in the States, a folkloric one. Mercy Brown is probably the most famous one. American vampires are very like their folkloric counterparts. In almost all cases, they are tied specifically to cases of tuberculosis. And the cure was to identify which family member was the vampire, dig them up, cut out the heart, burn it to ash, mix that ash in a tasty drink, and drink it to cure yourself. Because that's going to end well. I found evidence of a couple others in the Chicago area, and then one really weird little news bite about some suspected blood cult in Kansas that was active in like 1870 or something. I can only find it as like a 2-line byline. Google books, archives are wonderful things. You just go trolling around and like just hit a topic and scroll for hours. But I don't see any other report on what was actually going on.
That kind of drink, make the potion out of the ash, was done in the 2000s in Eastern Europe.
Oh yeah, no, I remember that report where
Yeah.
like that's the thing. Like it's hard to wrap your brain around, but there are still parts of the world where this is a thing. Like this is still a thing. Eastern Europe, and they've very seriously. There are people who are vampires, and there are dead who are vampires, and there's a thing that you're supposed to do about it. Vampire finders. Okay, so the folkloric vampire was not the celibate sort of vampire. One of the things that they would do specifically with spouses was they were believed to frequently come back, and instead of feeding off the spouse, they would just, you know, knock boots from sundown till sunup until they've exhausted the partner, and the partner wastes away because, you know, who can keep up with that? Now, it becomes convenient for people who end up having a kid 3 years after their husband's dead. And frequently, that's what led to Vampyre. Vampyre was a child that was supposedly conceived of a vampire, who was a dead guy, who was banging his wife. Because it totally does not look like the vicar. But Vampyres were thought to be, and were revered as, pretty much the ultimate vampire detectometer. They, because of that connection, would be able to go through the cemetery and pick out which grave held vampires. Another way of doing vampire detection was you would put a young boy on a white horse and kind of smack the horse on the bum and let the horse wander through the cemetery, and wherever the horse stopped, there was a vampire. I'm not sure, like beyond tarot symbolism, why, young naked boy, white horse, or any of that.
Wait, you didn't say it was naked.
Some of them he is.
It was a weird
Yeah,
time
well,
you said
that's,
he was
yeah,
naked.
I know. Well, bareback. Well. No, some of the folklore just gets mighty weird. To go to Harry Sen's book, he's got like this lovely compendium in the back of like all of the things that would make you be born so that you were condemned to come back as a vampire when you were dead, or any other circumstance in your life that would do not pass go, do not collect $200. You are going to rise from the dead and eat all your people. So if any kind of heresy, and that ties into the Eastern Orthodox stuff, vampire. If you are born with a little tail, if you are born with a certain ring around your pupils, if you're born with doubled pupils, if you're born with a unibrow, basically, and that was also a dead giveaway for werewolves. Let's see, if your parents were having sex and conceived you on Christmas or Easter, those are days where they should have been celibate. Vampire. and a whole host of other like little weird, pretty much like if you looked a little funny, you were probably a vampire, as far as the folklore goes. And this is stuff. Well, but most of us are just like, yeah, we're doomed. And I think the thing that fascinated me the most with Sen's book is like he's writing in the 70s, so this was living stuff. Like he's interviewing real people, and like, this is what we've been taught, and this is what we've handed down. And I would imagine that if you went and you found some of the rural areas, you would just hear pretty much the same stuff. Anybody have questions? Because I'll just kind of like ramble on little brain bits left and right.
What do you think about the connection between, say, hypnagogic sleep difficulties and the sort of succubus, incipient succubus legends, and how those are very, very similar to some of the vampire folklore, with the way people report that they've been visited by a vampire in their sleep, and the come back and have sex with a spouse. That's a completely new one for me, and I thought, well, that fits in pretty well with that.
They get very wibbly in like where a line may or may not be. I find it very telling. First of all, that the nightmare was something that Byron sought out to own, and he had this whole fascination with vampires to the point where Polidori basically made a caricature of Byron as a vampire. Okay, so to catch everybody else up on this, first of all, hypnagogic state. Emerging from sleep. It's that borderline state between sleeping and waking. Hallucinations are common. You don't necessarily parse them as hallucinations. They're those really weird, disjointed, not quite dreams. Some people will have like they'll see lights and chevrons. Some people hear phantom music. There's a number of really famous symphonies written based off of phantom music that somebody heard while they were falling asleep, and in that state. Coming out of sleep, you go through the same thing. It's got a lot to do with the stages that your brain goes through, brain waves, and I could get into that a whole lot, but there is another phenomenon that is tied to usually emerging from sleep, which is your brain is wired to essentially paralyze you when you are dreaming, so that you do not get up and act everything out. There are some tremendously horrible dysfunctional problems if that doesn't happen. The more common thing that people will experience is sleep paralysis. You are awake enough to be semi-aware of your surroundings. You probably think of yourself as more awake than you actually are, but you cannot move. And you feel like you are being pressed down to the bed. There's often a vibratory feeling, a kind of like shivering that you feel. Many people will feel it almost like something has repeatedly pushing them into the bed, only the bed is like this weird, like, whum, whum. Many people will get a sense of a presence in the room. Many people will perceive something shadowy. A lot of that is explicable in sleep paralysis is you're sort of trying to wake up enough and your eyes are kind of open, but you're not processing any of the sensory data in your area properly. It's still being chunked through dream.
Is that what they call night terrors?
Yes, the Mara, the night terrors, night hag, all of that is, and it's where we get our word nightmare from in the first place. There is a whole host of folklore that goes with that. Is it Dolphin? The Terror That Comes in the Night is probably the classic book on it.
Yes.
That is the terror that flaps in the night.
You mean the whole con right there.
I won't even get into Count Dracula.
Dracula.
Oh no, she's actually we're periscoping. Hello, everybody who is off elsewhere. Yeah. Okay, so I had to brush up on my Incubus and Succubus mythology for oh god, Monsters and Mysteries in America. They were like, "Can you talk about these?" And I'm like, "Yeah, probably." Have written, demon books, so sure. Okay, so first, Incubus, Succubus. What do the words mean? They're from Latin, incubus, incubare, to lie down upon. It's the same as the Mara, something that is pressing you into the bed. Succubus always confused me because they dropped a letter, subcubare, to lie beneath. So it's totally what position that demon prefers.
I've always heard succubus were the girl and incubus were the.
Because generally, it is medieval, and therefore the boys on top, the girls on the bottom. Medieval.
Real quick, just in today's modern terms, are succubuses still always girls and incubuses?
Yeah, pretty much. At this point, it's become kind of cemented in people's perception. Succubus is the chick demon, incubus is the boy demon.
Or a sneaker.
Yeah. Or Incubus, Succubus, really good band.
Well, Incubus is a band too.
Unless you're Zach Baggins, who couldn't tell the difference. And I really wanted to ask him, show me on the doll where the Incubus touched you. But that's just kind of a little dig. So, he got a better folklorist on his staff, so, another Belanger, actually. So, the line between, because they were also believed to be taking things from people. So there is some really Byzantine thinking in the medieval literature about incubus and succubus. I mean, it gets a little weird. It also explains why that baby looks like the vicar's kid. In a lot of the writing, they really think that the incubus and succubus is the same demon, capable of changing shape and changing sex willfully, so that the succubus would go, get a guy, carry seed, because they didn't believe that they could produce this themselves, and there were clearly babies being conceived by these experiences, and then transform to an incubus and deposit the seed that they'd stolen into some unwary nun or whatever. And
that was in a Stephen King book.
And that's folklore.
The good
That's
Stephen King books.
But that would also explain the shape-shifting into maybe the form of the vicar. But it wasn't really him.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing. It's like they would appear as, they would appear as someone, and so there was this whole, but there was often an attack aspect to that. I mean, the people would wake up and feel pressed down, and a whole lot of night terror stuff. Trying to separate out like what's night hag, incubus, succubus. Usually there's a sexual element, just straight up, and that's how it gets put into that box. And it gets tangled when there is also a predatory aspect above and beyond non-consensual sex with a non-physical entity, or a mostly physical entity because it's putting the stuff somewhere.
That could be formed also out of a PTSD. They think they dreamt it, so therefore it turns into night terror.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of like Freudian stuff you can do to try to like sort that stuff out. What I will say on it is certainly some instances of things reported as vampires could just as easily be classed as incubus or succubus attack. We get often, like with Dom Augustin Calmet, he was a monk, so he kind of would sanitize things in that way that those type reporting things would, so you don't get so much of the nitty-gritty stuff, and he might, like, you know, try to make a little hint of, you know, that there was something else going on, but he would do it in a very, very delicate and roundabout French way, because the original thing is French. It's translated into English as The Phantom World, free online, and it gets reprinted all over the place. It's really fascinating stuff if you can get through it. It's chunky. The question, as someone who's had to investigate paranormal stuff, is there any point in time where it is not actually sleep paralysis being misinterpreted? And that gets interesting, because I've investigated some stuff where there's the person sleeping having experiences, but people in the house are picking up on stuff too. And that sometimes has me just kind of tap out and go, there's weird shit in the world, sorry. Did I answer it all?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, having experienced sleep paralysis twice, it is utterly terrifying. And I was curious, as, you know, basically just curious as to what you're thinking on how those things blend and
they definitely do
feed into the vampire myth.
Sleep paralysis in many ways led to a lot of the reports. Well, one of the other things with some of the folkloric vampire, as much as they believed that this was literally the corpse in the tomb rising, if you look at the language in some of the reports, people are perceiving this also as sort of a non-physical entity that is capable of going through any locked door, any closed window. And this is how we interpret mist, but it's basically it's physical and it is also spirit. And it can kind of move in and out of the two. And, you know, frequently those things, they would wake up and it's on top of them.
Ooh, it's that thing from the magicians. That's all magic.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I noticed that I thought was interesting, is you have these folklores out there where the entity really seems to be non-material. It's happening during sleep. We would interpret it as, you know, some sort of dream state. And yet, if you archaeologically, if you find vampire graves, they're staked. Yeah. Things are pinned. There are heavy rocks that are put on top.
Stick bricks in the mouth.
And clearly, there is a perception that this is a physical thing that's just trying to get out of the grave.
You almost have to, in that time, like we have, in the culture that we live in, we are kind of mentally trained. Things have easy labels. Like, once you have a name, like, it fits in this box and that's what it is. And it's harder to kind of dial back this way of looking at it as both at the same time, and that it can be both a spirit thing and a physical thing, and that is without conflict. Like, it of course it can, you know, just turn itself into a thing, and it shows up here, and the corpse is still in the ground, and the corpse is kind of like the anchor of this thing, but they are one and the same. And the thing that is weird is, like, folks in the villages where this was happening, like, they would see the person, and they would recognize the person as who they were. In a few of the cases that I've read, they see a person, they describe them, they don't know who the heck this person is, and then, like, you know, a neighbor is like, you know, that's Cousin Olaf. What is Cousin Olaf doing, you know, attacking you in the night? And so there's some weird reasons, and, you know, you have to, at this point, you can't answer, like, you know, who was experiencing what, who fed who, is there confirmation bias going on? You can only go on what was written down. The Scandinavian stuff, that pressing, breath sucking, like the breath stealing, that's totally there, and it's telling that Mara comes from that whole region. And the lines, I delved into all of this totally going, I will know how to define the folkloric vampire, and I'm like, I know nothing at all of it. Where do you even, like, there's vampire fairies, there's the Leanne Shea, the Leanne Shea, she's the fairy girlfriend, she's kind of like weirdly a fairy and a vampire and a muse, all rolled into one. So she would find young men, she would woo them, and she, in feeding off of them, feeding off of their life, she would inspire them to brief but brilliant lives of poetry and music and song, but they would waste away under her love.
Because of hotter burning fires and more.
Yeah, and La Belle Dame sans Merci is another poem inspired by her. The Dark Dew is a little bit nastier. And even with fairies, especially like the Tuatha De Danann and pretty much all of the Fae folk in the British Isles, there's a really strong argument that they are the ancestral dead as well. They live in fairy raths. They live under the ground. Those fairy raths actually all turned out to be barrows. They're tombs. They are under these things, continuing in their feasts and their revels. They are great kings of old and princes and princesses. If you happen to be dragged into their revels, it's literally like Persephone in the underworld. If you eat anything, that you will not be able to leave. And it's the summer lands, it's this other place. And so the line between the blessed dead, between spirits, between the risen dead, between fairies, and every other word you want to give it is just a big freaking mess, to be honest.
There was a question from Periscope,
Sure.
Which was about whether modern books, TV, like the way that we see vampires today, is accurate at all to the history. Like, what's changed?
A lot has changed. So let me move a little bit from folklore. So let me show you how we moved from folklore to what we have now with the vampire, well, with sparkly vampires. But, you know, so, I mean, if you like Twilight, that's great. I don't. I won't pretend that I do. Okay, so these things were going on in Eastern Europe. Peasants are all aflutter, digging up people. And I mean, these things would happen in like great, like almost vampire viral outbreaks, to the point where government officials had to get involved. I mean, when the folks out in the hinterlands are just, you know, digging up their relatives and mutilating corpses and starting to, like, you know, look at some of the older neighbors that live on the outskirts, and, you know, maybe the axe is going to turn toward them. And it's similarly to the time, like, it's a tail end of the witch craze where bad stuff was happening anyway. So government officials get involved, they start writing reports. Some of those reports make their way to Western Europe and to Britain specifically, and people are like, oh my God! I mean, it's the kind of like, it went viral. They were fascinated by it. It was a titillating, horrific, crazy thing that all those little country bumpkins were doing, and it had this sort of like terrifying, people like ghost stories. The first person that we can generally definitively say takes vampires and turns them into a fictional thing, it's in a poem. I've never read a good English translation. It's either that or it's a really terrible poem. And it's Heinrich August Ossenfelder. It's in German. It's, I think, 1748, first half of the 1700s, and it's plainly enough called Der Vampyre. And it just talks about, you know, how mothers warn their daughters about vampires, and they're going to go off and do bad things, things that they shouldn't be doing anyway, and they're going to be preyed upon by vampires, and they kind of get their just reward. Yay. Probably, well, there's Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, which was a penny dreadful, serialized, limping, rollicking, weird thing. It's pen written, and I think Thomas Reimer. So Varney the Vampire, let me see, he ends up dying in Mount Vesuvius. He casts himself woefully into Mount Vesuvius, as things do in, you know, this time period. It's very, very early 1800s. Slightly before that, there's Samuel Taylor Coleridge writes a poem called Christabel. There's a vampire in Christabel called Geraldine. A lot of literary types could spill a lot of ink over whether or not there were lesbian overtones to this poem, because Geraldine and Christabel, there's some things going on there that may be innocent and may not be, but it does sort of strike the note of transgressive sexuality being a part of the vampire as it moves into fiction, and that becomes important for a significant flashpoint. Lord Byron. Contrary to the byline in 1819, when the story The Vampire with a Y was serialized, he was not the person who wrote it. His physician, John William Polidori, did. Byron had a weird fascination for this stuff. In Byron's day, when you did your coming of age, especially when you were a little lord, you were expected to do like a tour of the continent. Well, the problem was Napoleon was doing a very different sort of tour of the continent. So there were lots of places you really couldn't go safely. Not that Byron wasn't tempted to anyway. So he ended up going through the Mediterranean, going to Greece, Turkey, and some points that you don't ordinarily go to. And this is where he was introduced to folkloric ideas of the vampire. He writes a poem called The Giaour, and it contains lines like, "But first on earth as vampire sent, thy corpse shall from thy tomb be rent, and ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race." And he's taking the stories that he'd heard about vampires coming back and feeding off of people, and he as a romantic poet, romanticizes it. Byron had some weird ideas about like being foredoomed to wickedness. He was a larger-than-life sort of person. And whether he believed it or didn't believe it or was just making stuff up. I mean, this is the guy who, when people were doing renovations on Newstead Abbey, his family home, and they dug up the skull of some hapless monk, he summarily had it cleaned off, sent into town, and turned into a drinking cup, upon which he inscribed a jaunty little poem about wine in his head.
Like you.
Yeah, and like you do. So Polidori was Italian Catholic, and at the very least bi, and probably gay, and he had it bad for Byron. Byron was renowned for being the pursuer but not the pursued, and he was kind of a dick to Polidori. So 200 years ago this year, this June, a bunch of friends got together. Byron at this point had to leave England because he'd pissed his wife off a whole lot, he'd pissed some other people off a whole lot, and some of the allegations, at that point, sodomy was a hanging crime. So he had to kind of beat feet. So he's at this place called the Villa Diodati. It's in Geneva. It's near the lake in Geneva. 1816 is the year without a summer. There were some geologic events that put a whole lot of ash in the air that folks over in Western Europe had no clue had happened, but all they knew is all it did was freaking rain. And so you've got Lord Byron, John William Polidori, this other rapscallion named Percy Bysshe Shelley, this 18-year-old girl that Percy just kind of like trotted off with her half-sister, and by the way, they did often share one another, Claire Claremont, the half-sister, Mary Wollstonecraft. And they all get together, and it is a stew of wild, creative, strange sorts of people.
There were drugs.
There were drugs, there was copious alcohol, there were jumping around in lightning storms just for the heck of it. Like, there was lots of stuff going on, but the literary story that you will learn when you are in high school is that they challenged one another to a ghost story writing contest. Polidori's version of this, Byron actually started writing this sort of vampire thing and decided it was crap and kind of tossed it away. And Polly was like, Polly, who had unrequited issues, decided to go the way of another spurned lover of Byron's, Lady Caroline Lamb, who had made a caricature of Byron in a story she called Glenarvan. She called this guy Lord Ruthven, if you're pronouncing it phonetically, and it was really obviously Byron. Caroline Lamb was basically the first celebrity stalker. Like if you hear some of the stuff, she would go to the parties that Byron was at and just like start shouting from the street. Break into his house and like leave notes to him in his books. Remember me, remember me. So she had already established the character of Lord Ruthven as a thinly veiled caricature of Byron. Polidori takes this story and goes, Lord Ruthven. And he pours every amount of completely conflicted attraction, angst, hate, and revulsion into this character. And it's obviously Byron to pretty much everybody at the time. Lord Ruthven is pretty much the first place where you have the vampire as a nobleman who is preying upon people. About the one thing that's different from Lord Ruthven between him and Byron is Ruthven, for whatever reason, could only prey upon virgins. Byron was never that particular. Did not care. So this comes out in 1819, and it's a flashpoint. Not just because it's kind of like done a reinterpretation of the myth. And Polidori has some aspects of the vampire preying on people, the blood and everything, but there's this weird connection to the moon. dies at one point, but he's resurrected in moonlight, and there's some things that got tossed along the way. Because of, this is my literary opinion, because of the character, because the story's not that good. Like, it's not well written. It's weird to kind of lump through. It's awkward, like really awkward in places. But because there's a real person behind this figure, and it's a recognizable person, and it's a very complicated, ambiguous, like ambivalent character, it ignites something for people. And it's a perfect storm at the time. Like, this is the Romantic era. It's the era of Gothic novels, the Castle of Otranto. Matthew Lewis's The Monk. It's the time of, basically, if you saw Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak, like, that is an homage, point by point, to the stories that were popular at this time. Abandoned, strange castles, incest, crazy old, like, heiresses and murder and bodies under the floorboards and all of it, and people were just drunk on the outre. Byron fits right into that. Ruthven becomes this flashpoint and ignites throughout the rest of the 1900s this huge fascination. Sets off, there are stage plays. There is a fellow, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who also, he does Carmilla. And it was interesting to me reading 1972, Basil Copper was writing, he's got a book called The Vampyre, because we get real creative with our titles. And he's talking about Carmilla, and it was telling to me that he can't tell, like, it didn't parse to Basil Copper at the time that the narrator of this is a young girl, because of the tension between her and Carmilla. Like, he had goggles about it. But again, that sexual subversion, that kind of like, that outsider status as like forbidden sexuality just kind of gets woven into it throughout the whole time. So he writes Carmilla. There's a mother who reads this guy's stories to her young son a little while later, because they're Irish, and Le Fanu is Irish, and this is good Irish stories. And this fellow, Bram, grows up and does another flashpoint in the same way that Polidori did. So when Bram Stoker writes Dracula, in order to kind of create this immortal character, he does some research. You can question exactly how good the research was, but he roots this character in a historical figure, Vlad Tepes. And I mean, at this point, most people know that Dracula has things in common with Tepes. What he did for the figure of Dracula, the appearance of the character, the piercing eyes, the aquiline face, the wild hair. Bram Stoker was a theater manager. He managed the Lyceum Theater in London. He managed a tremendously famous Shakespearean actor, probably one of the best ever, Sir Henry Irving. If you go through the description, the first description of Dracula in Stoker's novel, and you look at a picture of Sir Henry Irving, he is describing Irving. This makes a lot of sense because he intended for Dracula to eventually become a stage play, and he wanted Irving to play it. Irving thought the whole thing was dreadful and wanted nothing to do with it, even when they did a read-through to protect the rights to it. But Stoker also, and there's a really, really good biography on Stoker by Barbara Belford that will explore this much more in depth. Stoker had a very complicated relationship with Irving. Irving was a very dominant personality. He had a force of will on people. Stoker became his theater manager. They'd run across one another. Stoker attended a dramatic recitation. I'm pretty sure it was The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which was written by Coleridge, who is also the Christabel dude. There's this weird connection to Coleridge all the way through everything, because Mary and her half-sister Claire Claremont were inspired to get interested in all the weird stuff because they weren't supposed to be listening to this visiting poet reciting his work, and they snuck into the living room where their dad, where where Mary's dad was, to listen to him, and hid behind the couch, and it's Coleridge reciting the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So there's just some weird, nifty, fun things. The legacies we leave in our creative endeavors. By some reports, and certainly by Barbara Belford, by her account, he was a bit of an egoist and kind of hard on the ladies, like he was overbearing. Whether he was a womanizer or not, who knows. But Stoker, as his manager, was often put in two different positions. The good friend, who frequently did work for Irving and just left his wife and kid to just do whatever they were doing, like long hours. Theater hours are late into the night. They're vampire hours, period. But also someone who had to try to stand up to this guy who, when he first attends this reading, Irving has such a force of personality, such an ability to just embody the characters that he is projecting through his face, his voice, his manner. Stoker has basically a fit. He's this big, stalwart, sturdy Irishman, and he's so overwhelmed by this man's charisma that he had a little fit of apoplexy. He mentions it, he writes about it in his reminiscences. And the fact that he had this kind of effect on him, and from many other indications, Irving had this ability. He was just one of those people who just completely filled a room. And if you either were in awe or you were knocked over, or a little bit of both. Stoker takes not just the appearance of Irving, he takes that aspect of Irving. He takes that domineering personality. He takes that ability to mesmerize people, that ability to almost hypnotize people with his voice, with his very presence, and weaves it into the character of Dracula. And it's one of the most igniting, galvanizing things about that character, that Lugosi manages to capture it, and God, Christopher Lee manages to capture it. Edward Cullen,
Gary
Oldman.
yeah, oh yeah, no, Oldman, man of 1,000 faces. Yeah, he gets it. He really gets it. And Frank Langella for the time, there's a number of people who managed to catch it. Stoker casts himself into two roles in his book. He doesn't just have Irving running around. Stoker, his first name is Abraham, much like a fellow named Von Helsing, who has to save the women from Dracula. And that's echoing some of the role that he played, just kind of managing this huge personality so that, especially the other gals in the theater wouldn't just be kind of run roughshod over by him. But in his own writings about Irving had such a force of personality that Stoker had a hard time standing up to him when they were face to face. He would just find himself agreeing. He'd just find himself going, sure, whatever you want. And so the other guy that he is in Dracula is Renfield. And in a lot of ways, he's exploring this complicated relationship. And I argue that one of the reasons that this is such a flashpoint of literature, why it ignites us, is there's very human things, very relatable things, very real personal interactions echoed in the book. And I think that makes it live beyond the page in a way that Polidori's Vampyre does a little bit. It's kind of dated now. I've sought it out. I've read it. It's just plain weird in some places, and it is very much a story of its time. I mean, suddenly they're in this cabin, and somehow Ruthven has abducted the narrator's betrothed, and now she's dead, and oh my goodness, and blah. And I mean, you could just see people in the scenery. And, Christopher Walken would be the only person who could play this game. Just enough, maybe you're abusive, but just enough scenery chewing, just enough completely batshit crazy stuff.
Ham.
Was there, time? Okay.
15 minutes.
Okay, so I could talk a lot about this. So all of that gets picked up and moved into kind of where we're at. Theater, film, stories where we pick them up, and every new retelling takes a little bit of that, and everybody wants to put a little bit of their spin on it. Anne Rice makes a fairly significant contribution and changes vampires I'll say before Anne Rice, it's actually Dark Shadows. There's this change in the vampire. Christopher Lee's Dracula always must die. He always comes back, but he's still irredeemably a bad guy. It's half the reason he's really interesting. Barnabas Collins becomes a human vampire, a humane vampire, somebody who's trying to work against his nature, who is relatable in his struggle, in his guilt. And he ushers in this new era of vampires are ourselves. Vampires are this dark mirror in which we see our own struggles, our own issues with our humanity. And it becomes very much a fun, potent metaphor. And it's certainly something that in many, many ways we're not like casting off and always trying to kill. Different takes on it, like 30 Days of Night, goes right back to vampires are big, bad nasties. Run. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, it takes a season before it's Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And they did not initially want Spike to be anything but a bad guy, but he made such a wicked bad guy that in order to make his character something that could continue, they had to create basically the Barnabas Collins, like that conflict, that there was something redeemable, that there was something noble there, that we could see that projected human struggle in the monster.
A million teenage girls awoken to their sexuality.
Pretty much, yeah, the sound of 1,000 panties dropping all at once. Go Sonic Boom.
Not angels, Spike.
Yeah, I never could get into... I'm biased. Marsters is a really cool guy.
Oh, yeah. He's big low.
Yeah. All right, I will take, one last question? Or not?
I had one.
I just wanted to make a comment.
Yeah. Comments are good, too.
I was watching The Making of American Werewolf in London, and John Landis said that his inspiration was when he was working on Kelly's Heroes. They walked past a gypsy funeral, and they were burying the body upside down, and they were doing all this stuff. And he asked their interpreter, "What are they doing?" And he said, "Oh, they're afraid he's going to come back." And he's like, "What do you mean come back?" And he's like, "Yeah, they're afraid, so they're burying him upside down. So when he starts to come back, he'll just keep digging down." And he said it was, and the interpreter just said, "Yes, peasants, what are you going to do?" And that night, John Landis was thinking, if he actually gets up, me and our interpreter are dead.
Yeah.
There's nothing we can do in the face of these powers we don't understand. And that was what gave him the inspiration for American Werewolf in London, which was people dealing with powers they couldn't understand.
There are many, many great minds exploring all aspects of this. Browning currently is a really, really good go-to guy for not just Dracula and Stoker. Like his collection is growing. He's an up-and-coming intellectual scholar, and I forget where he's teaching, and he can yell at me later. Elizabeth Miller is a time-honored name. Let me see, who else? I'm going to blank on half of them now because I didn't drink all of my caffeine. In Search of Dracula. They wrote In Search of Dracula together. Radu Florescu, who's passed away since, he was teaching at Brown University, and or Brown University, sorry. And he's even from around here. Well, if you look up In Search of Dracula, they did some neat stuff. And I'm just going to blank on his name. And J. Gordon Melton, who did the Vampire Encyclopedia. And a bunch of other fun people, too.
Oh, I remembered what I wanted to say.
Okay.
I saw this on an internet review thing once, but the original book of For I Am Legend, I think it's the same name.
Yeah, it is.
The zombie people things are actually more vampiric than they realize, because there was an older movie, Vincent Price as the hero, where they kind of interpret that. And like it's just really interesting how the zombie and the vampire kind of started. It's the same thing like you were saying earlier.
Yeah, Risen Dead.
Yeah.
Pretty much the Hungry Dead. I mean that goes all the way back. The idea that the dead hunger for that which they no longer have, and that you need to feed them. Like back to Babylon and Sumeria, where you would still bury the dead body like under the floorboards of your house. Well, you didn't have floorboards, but under the house. And if you didn't, they wanted water. And if you didn't give them that, bad stuff would ensue. There's whole tons of like liturgies and funerary offerings in the ancient Egyptian tradition. And the whole reason you're feeding those things in the tomb is so that they don't come out of the tomb and go noshing on you and trying to get stuff and causing bad luck to your family because you're not paying proper respect to the dead. So that is an old thing.
What ethnicity or what language does the term chewing dead come from?
Nachschütter. That is German. Oh God. If you could, I think he has passed away since, but there is a fellow, Rob Brottingham, used to live in the Netherlands and did an underground magazine called International Vampire. This man just one of those delightfully obsessive scholar types, just collected all of that. So the Shroud Eater, the Nachschütter, that's German. There were a couple of other words that are gonna blank, but yet they would be wrapped, of course, in a shroud, and one of the signs was they had chewed through the shroud, and the shroud was a little bloody. And again, it's things that it's going to be in contact with the part of the face where more moisture is coming through. It's going to rot faster, but it looks, and some of them were believed to chew their own fingers off. Those fingers totally didn't rot. They were eating their fingers out of desperation because they weren't eating the neighbors.
So it can't quite be any rats chewing on them or anything.
Well, Okay. So, I write lots of nonfiction stuff on all of these things. I've got a fiction series called, the first book is Conspiracy of Angels. There are vampires. They're not the only things. And they're, of course, a fun take, my take. I think it's fun. The second book comes out in August, and that is Harsh Gods. You don't have to like it, you don't have to buy it, but, I'm going to actually pimp it for once. I usually forget.
Yay. And where can people find you online?
MichelleBelanger.com. Honestly, if you Google whack Michelle and Vampire at probably the first 15 pages.
Red hair.
Because I've been writing and doing this and speaking on vampires for quite some time.
History Channel. How much did they pay you?
I would love to say I got paid for that. Generally speaking, if you are a talking head on something like that, you are very, very lucky if they paid your way to go somewhere. HBO was we got food. That was awesome. My first 2 seasons on Paranormal State. Payment? Huh.
They didn't pay you anything for the
they probably covered them.
Eventually they did, and then the last season I still haven't got paid for.
Oh, okay, you wait.
The first 2 seasons I went on as a favor to Elfie and Josh, and I went on free. And when Ryan found out that nobody had even offered to pay me, he kind of had a little fit, as he wants to do on production, and made it so that we were getting some compensation, but not as much as you would probably think.
No.
But no, really, one of the things as a writer, and
you're not going to get paid. You're right.
Well, what you really want is to be able to go, I have an authority on this, here, I want to educate people on this. Getting good information out is way more important to me than putting money in my pocketbook, and while that's not always a choice I would suggest people to make, for me it was a very important choice to make. And especially because I'm often speaking as an advocate for fringe communities. This is how I was on CNN headline news. There was some dad who became convinced that his troubled daughter had run off and been abducted by a vampire cult in Washington State, because that's where the Cullens live, so obviously that's what happened. Yeah.
That's funny.
And it just kind of snowballed from there. And what had actually happened is she met somebody. She was really unhappy with stuff that was going on. There was family stuff. There was mitigating family stuff. And she was 17, going to be 18 in a couple of months, and she ran off with a guy that she met online.
Did it turn out happily for her?
Yeah. Actually, I happened to have a friend who was at the time a homicide detective who worked with the FBI, who was right in the area where she'd gone missing. And I'm like, hey, friend, could you go check this out? He's like, got it. And he tracked her down within 24 hours.
He's like, she's fine.
So yeah.
So much for that vampire cult.
Yeah, but so it is often more important for me to get good information out than to put money in the pocketbook. And individual results with that will vary. I've eaten a lot of ramen. And good night. Thank you.